I do think I have a slightly more in-depth view of how grief can take many forms. And it is actually quite, if you step back, it's quite interesting because it really doesn't take the same form, at any given time. You have one person who's experienced a death, and then another person right next to them who's experienced the same death, but they're reacting completely differently. Um, and that is the thing about it. I think the first initial thing that I could say from my therapy is that there is no right way to react. Um, but it is always going to be important to not isolate yourself in those moments, even though it's really, really tempting to. All you want to do is shut the world away. But the problem with that is you almost fall into a spiral of sorrow and being withdrawn. And not only then are you dealing with the grief and the sorrow and the loss, you are then also dealing with a lack of connection to other people, and feeling lonely and not being distracted when you probably really need to be distracted. When I was receiving DBT therapy, which stands for dialectical behavior therapy, created by Dr. Marsha Linehan. When I was doing that, one of the huge things that they taught us was distraction isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's necessary because our mind and our emotions and our nervous system is just so overloaded, it cannot process whatever is happening externally, whether it's news of a death or a breakup or an argument with a family member or friend. Those are all forms of losses and grief. And for me, I sometimes just have to sit and watch a comfort show. Like, my comfort show is The Office US. I've watched it in an insane amount of times, but it is very much a sort of visual uh, and immersive safe space for me where I can sort of switch off if things become overwhelming. And I think everyone should have something like that. And the idea of, just having to sit with it all the time is not necessarily, I think, what anyone should be doing. I think it's a healthy balance of processing, maybe journaling, talking with people about it, and not thinking about it 24/7 because it will just eat you up, basically. And my beliefs around, what I mentioned earlier about sort of the spiritual reincarnation, I think that for me has been a really important belief to help me process the grief that I have processed. Or I suppose processing it isn't really, it's, there's no A to B and then, okay, yeah, it's done now, I've processed it. It's a lot more like, okay, I've processed this part of it. And you're always going to be processing traumatic events, especially loss, um, because the brain is trying to analyze, how did this happen? Why did this happen? What can I do to stop myself feeling like this? Because I can't bear feeling like this. So for me, finding this belief that fits with my principles, that fits with how I perceive the world and my sort of spiritual religious aligning, having those beliefs has helped me process the deaths I've experienced in my life, basically. Sorry, I start to go on a tangent and then I just start rambling. But that's kind of the point of the podcast. So, yeah. And just circling back to how loss can take many forms, it's sort of what I briefly mentioned again earlier with sort of breakups or conflicts or even losing friends, moving house. There are so many ways that loss can present itself. And I think 50% at least of being able to navigate that loss and that grief is by being able to understand it. So, the words grief and loss are not exclusive to death. It can be the loss of, like I said, loss of a home, loss of a family unit, loss of a partner. That's all loss. And there's always grief to it. And sometimes that grief can be harder because it's constant, whether it be constantly recurring conflict or a breakup that, is quite fractured. All of those things mean that you haven't got the space and the time to process because you're just going through it again and again and again. And eventually your nervous system can't tolerate it. And you haven't even got the space all the time to step back and go, how do I make this situation better for me? And in those moments, this is exactly why it's so important to have a support network, other people you can talk to and talk things through with, so that you're not isolated in it. And I actually think that everything I said about sort of coping and dealing with death is actually pretty similar for all of these scenarios. But you need to first create space for you to step back and go, oh, okay, I need to heal. I need to restore myself. I need to come back to me and not be, you know, basically taken away with whatever this loss and this grief is or where it's coming from. Do let me know if you'd like me to talk a bit more in depth about breakups or family dynamics, things like that. Anything that you feel is causing you potentially grief or sadness or loss. Um, and I could do a sort of longer, more in depth episode about it because I think there's so much behind all of those things that I couldn't fit it into one episode. So do let me know. Feel free to contact me on Instagram. Um, what else do I have? YouTube, TikTok. Um, you can comment on the podcast episode, and yeah, just let me know. My my handles, my username, whatever you want to call it, is probable entity. um and yeah, I would love to hear what you guys want to hear more of, maybe what you want to hear less of. But just to close today's episode, my advice for anyone experiencing loss or grief is to A, do not judge yourself for how you are responding. These are your natural emotional responses. It's important to embrace it and understand it and just be with it. But B, also making sure that you aren't guilting yourself into sitting there and being like, oh my god, I can't watch this funny video and I can't laugh at it because I'm grieving, things like that. You're allowed to heal, you're allowed to feel better. In fact, that's what we should be encouraging each other to do. So just basically do not judge yourself for how you react to grief or death or loss. All you need to focus on is healing, restoring, processing, moving forward. um, and I wanted to mention as well, just earlier, when I mentioned death, and loss not necessarily being exclusive to one another, there's an interesting concept around that with tarot. Um, the death card usually means the death of something, the death of a habit, the death of a relationship. It rarely means the very literal term death. And I think that kind of ancient layered sort of belief around what death actually means is quite inspiring. It's helped me um, sort of see death in a much more, I suppose, philosophical, existential way rather than the very literal sense. And it's helped me open my eyes to I suppose, just the ebbs and flows of life. Um, so, yeah, I'm going to end the podcast here. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you guys listening. I'm working really hard to get these episodes out to you on time while seriously tackling some mental health difficulties at the moment. So please do be patient if I'm not as routine as I'd like to be. But I hope you benefited from today's episode, and do feel free to give feedback. I am really open to it. I'm really open to suggestions. And yeah, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.